It is the final day of early voting, and both parties are holding big rallies in South Florida. We are there live.
The running mate debate. One candidate is here, the other is not. What do they bring to the table?
A text to help kids in Broward. Will voters there say yes to continue funding the Children's Services Council? You may have to search for that question on your ballot.
Good morning and welcome aboard this morning. We have a lot to cover with you on this last day of early voting and countdown to Tuesday.
We will take you live to some big political rallies that are taking place here in South Florida on this Souls to the Polls Sunday, and later on we will get expert analysis and opinion from our Powerhouse Roundtable.
And we begin, though, with the candidates for Lieutenant Governor. We worked very hard, you should know, to accommodate the schedules of both candidates. And in the end, Charlie Crist's running mate, Annette Taddeo, chose to be elsewhere today.
But incumbent Lieutenant Governor Carlos Lopez-Quintero of Miami is live with us in our studio. There he is. He is a former state representative. He was the Miami-Dade property appraiser until Rick Scott tapped him for the Lieutenant Governor post. And he is known as CLC to his friends.
LTCLC. Good morning.
We're glad to have you come in. Thanks very much.
Well, I wouldn't be anywhere else. Back home in Miami and this weekend in South Florida with the new roundtable. I haven't been to it yet, but there's nowhere I would rather be last Sunday before the election.
How interesting that the next lieutenant governor, whoever it is going to be from Miami and Hispanic candidate from Miami. And let's start out with this campaign.
Yeah. It's been a long one. It's been a long summer, but I've enjoyed it. I've been from Pensacola to Miami and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But I found a lot of support, a lot of energy for Governor Scott. Basically because he did what he said he was going to do. Nobody can deny, not even Democrats can deny, not even Charlie Crist can deny that Rick Scott ran on jobs. Well, 651,000 jobs later, unemployment rate almost cut in half, state budget that had a $3.5 billion shortfall that he inherited from Charlie Crist now has a $1.2 billion surplus. So he's done what he said he was going to do.
Well, there are some promises kept, and then there are some promises not kept. But let's look more closely at this jobs numbers, Carlos. I don't think that any reputable economist would say that Charlie Crist single-handedly lost 832,000 jobs, which went away during his tenure, or that Rick Scott deserves credit for the 651,000 created in the last 4 years. How much credit does the governor get for that?
Well, let's first start with your first point on Charlie Crist. Let's say, for argument's sake, that he had no responsibility for the 830,000 jobs that were lost.
Well, very
even
little.
Though Texas added 200,000 jobs at the exact same time. But let's just say, for argument's sake,
they had a petroleum boom.
Because they took advantage of one of their assets. So let's just say, for argument's sake, that Charlie had nothing to do with it. If he's the guy that is always saying how much he cares about people and he cares, when the unemployment rate was at its highest, when foreclosures were at their highest, when things were at their worst, probably in the history of Florida, that's the exact moment when it needed leadership, and he chose to run for yet another political position.
Can you speak to your position in those same years? You were in the House, the State House. Wasn't it partially your and your fellow legislators' responsibility to do something along with the governor?
We're trying, but leadership matters.
Let me jump in and say it was the legislature dominated by Republicans, and you were the House Minority Leader that said, yeah, we understand we're going to have to raise some taxes and fees on auto tag registrations, and you voted for that stuff.
Like I said, leadership matters. When the governor is the leader of the state, the leader of the state sets the agenda, sets the tone. When the governor of the state is not giving you a lot of options, you are stuck with very limited options. If Rick Scott had been there, I can say without hesitation, things would have gone a lot differently. Now let's look at the 651,000 new jobs. Governor Scott has clearly created at least an environment here that attracts jobs, and I can point specific things that have made a difference. When he came in, he called for investment in tourism, one of the pillars of our economy. Recognizing that that's one of the pillars, he called for more investment in advertising our state to the country and to the world.
There's been a lot of success there, no question.
You know, the governor has campaigned on exactly those numbers. That's the answer to almost every question he gets asked. As his chief campaigner right now, as second in command, does it disturb you at all or concern you that this governor has been criticized for just not answering questions? Would you like voters to hear him answer more directly to more specific questions other than the job count?
Well, if I had been treated by certain members of the press, like Governor Scott has, I probably would do the same thing that he's doing. It's been the most aggressive and nasty treatment that I've seen of any governor. I'm not talking about you two, but
Well,
others.
you can talk about the two of us. We interviewed Governor Scott last weekend, and people who watch this show, I hope, watched that interview, and a number of them have come up to me in this subsequent week and have said, well, gee, we were waiting for some answers from Governor Scott. I mean, we asked our questions, we thought, courteously, and they were civil, and he just wanted to talk about Charlie Crist. He didn't want to really talk about anything else.
Well, that's because this race is so important. You have a governor that has delivered, has produced results. The GDP of Florida is beating the national GDP growth. Unemployment has dropped. It's the second largest drop in unemployment in the country. We've added more jobs in several months this year than any other state in the country. Investment in tourism brought 10 million more visitors in just 2 years to Florida. Those people spend money here and support and create jobs. So this governor has produced results. Charlie Crist, the reason we talk about Charlie Crist is because it's so easy for him just to look at a camera and lie to the voters and tell them that he cares when he doesn't. The only thing Charlie cares about is his own political career, his own image, and his own vanity.
Voters are making up their minds about that. Let me ask you about something that we asked the governor about last week. I mean, it is certainly within his right to say, I believe in traditional marriage between a man and a woman. I think a lot of people in the state do. In 2008, 62% said that's the way it should be when they passed that amendment. But he says he has no responsibility to call up Pam Bondi and say 32 states in the United States now have legally said same-sex marriage can exist because the courts have said so. But Florida continues to appeal. There have been 4 state court judges and 1 federal judge who have said Florida's ban on same-sex marriage is unconstitutional. Do you think that the governor should call up the Attorney General and say, hey, just stop these appeals?
Well, the Attorney General has her own responsibilities. And let me put it in this perspective. Let's say the Amendment 2 passes, and there are people who are in disagreement with its passage, and then they file a lawsuit. And even though the governor and the Attorney General have both said that it is wrong for Florida, if it were to pass and the voters were to put it in the Constitution, she would fight to defend that just as hard as she's fighting to defend other constitutional amendments.
Excuse me, attorneys general in Wisconsin, Virginia, Arizona, have all said, even though they had these bans, and these are Republican attorneys general, they have said, we see the handwriting on the wall and we're going to stop.
So are you saying that the Attorney General of Florida should ignore the law that requires her to defend the Constitution because
I think the question,
she shouldn't be defending it?
The question, I think, and this goes to personal opinion, I think that we asked was, we wanted the governor to weigh in on personally, does he think this ban is discrimination? And he has not said yes or no yet. Do you know?
What we want to make sure is nobody is discriminated against. The voters put this in the Constitution. The voters decided that this should be in the Constitution. Charlie Crist was the one running around signing the petition and waving it around to everybody.
Do you think it's discrimination that same-sex couples in Florida cannot marry?
I'm not an attorney. I'm not one to judge discrimination as it relates to this litigation. What we have said, and this is the most important thing, and this is all that should matter, whatever the courts ultimately decide, that is what we will respect. If they decide that it is unconstitutional, we will respect that. And it's a shame that this has become so politicized, because real people's emotions are in play here, and it's a shame that this is politicized as much as it is.
In the minute that we have left, Medicaid expansion. Now the governor is for taking the federal money for Medicaid expansion. What will you all do if reelected to make that happen?
We will take the funds as long as it doesn't create an additional burden on the taxpayers of Florida.
How do you do that with the legislature?
Well, I have a little bit of experience in legislating, and you sit there and you sit down, you go to a table, and you come up with a compromise that works for everybody.
Well, the first 3 years, the federal government says, we're going to give you $51 billion over 10 years. The first 3 years, we pick up all the cost. That sounds like a pretty good deal, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, but there's a lot of promises that come from the federal government that don't come through. Look, the federal government promised they were going to put the money for the port dredging in Miami-Dade, and they didn't. And who did? Rick Scott. The federal government said they were going to put funding into the Everglades for restoration. They didn't. Who did? Rick Scott. So there's a lot of promises that come from the federal government, and putting it in those terms, Michael, is a little bit unfair.
Lieutenant Governor, glad to have you come in. Sorry we don't have more time. Come back again.
Thank you.
All right, South Florida voters are the big focus today for the men who want to be governor. Rick Scott and Charlie Crist are rallying here today, and we will take you there live next.
Also, an important question on the back of the Broward ballot: will you keep paying a tax for children's programs? Stay tuned.
You sit down and there you go.
Oh, I think it's going to be a snake.
Okay, we're done. Next guest.
Right here. That would be really awkward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No live.
With just about 4 hours left now for early voting, the candidates for governor are both in town for a last big push to the polls, and they bring with them some big names in support.
Some very big names. In just a few minutes, Vice President Joe Biden will be arriving to attend a political rally at FIU for Charlie Crist. Local 10 News reporter Ross Palumbo is there, and he joins us live with a preview. Ross, good morning.
Good morning, Michael and Glenna. You know, on the heels of Governor Rick Scott pushing an additional $13 million into his campaign, this is what Charlie Crist is doing, holding a major rally on the FIU campus this morning, taking place in just a few minutes. Vice President Joe Biden will be here along with Representative Joe Garcia. Even actor William Levy will be in attendance, and as you can see back here behind me, it is just now about to get underway.
I heard it's a dead heat.
Hundreds of voters on the outside,
But I think he's going to make it.
security making the way for Charlie Crist and Joe Biden on the inside.
Well, I like to hear the vice president and hear his rationales why we should all get out to vote.
It's the second swing through the Sunshine State for the vice president.
Joe Biden.
His first trip with Charlie Crist at Broward College last month, and now another chance at FIU to win over the few undecided voters.
Undecided, actually.
Yes, I have until like Tuesday to decide, so I'm still looking for all these options and what all these candidates have to offer.
This comes as challenger Rick Scott has just offered another $13 million of his personal money to his campaign.
I'm running as a Democrat.
Flippin' unbelievable.
To bring his political ads to a final fevered pitch, he's now spent nearly $70 million.
He's just too shady for the Sunshine State.
That's almost double Chris' war chest of $36 million. He's hoping harder campaigning. This FAMU appearance yesterday, several stops in South Florida today will make up the difference with his message.
How you doing?
Already, independent voters are leaning his way, giving him a slight edge in the latest poll, 3 points above Governor Rick Scott.
I'm humbled by it, I'm honored by it, but I know we need to work hard and we have to run through the finish line.
That finish line begins here, the last push through the last days.
It's very important that people exercise their right to vote, so that's why I'm here.
Well, you know, we had a chance to talk to many of the people that have come out to hear the vice president and Charlie Crist. Most of them say they've already decided or already voted. So the final push here is really just to get these people out to reach their friends and family and convince them. From here, Charlie Crist and Joe Biden will head to another event in Fort Lauderdale. We'll have complete coverage of that coming up tonight at 5 and 6. And Glenn and Michael, I can tell you, I just spoke with the Crist campaign a few minutes ago. We were talking about the polling numbers and what's happening with Governor Rick Scott pumping all that additional money into his TV and radio buys. And they say at this point, the only numbers they are looking at are the voter turnout numbers. And that's what this event and the rest of the events they have lined up for the next 2 days are really designed for. Back to you.
Ross, thanks a million. We appreciate it. And voter turnout is indeed the name of the game.
In about 2 hours, Governor Rick Scott will be arriving in Hialeah as his 2-week bus tour around the state wraps up. Governor Scott was in Fort Myers yesterday alongside U.S. Senator Marco Rubio.
But with him today will be former Florida Governor Jeb Bush, still a very popular Republican who has been ramping up his presence on the national stage lately. Now we want to turn our attention to an important question on the ballot in Broward County.
It's a question that's kind of hidden on that ballot, and it asks if taxpayers want to continue paying a relatively small property tax to fund the Children's Services Council. Cindy Arenberg-Seltzer is the CEO and president of the CSC, as it's known. This agency helps more than 150,000 children annually by funding a variety of programs. Good morning. Thanks so much for being in.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Cindy, we are glad you're here. The CSC, I will say, I have a bias in favor of it. I think that you do some remarkable work. Bottom line here is, are the taxpayers of Broward County getting a good return on their investment?
They absolutely are, Michael, and thank you for being a little biased in our favor. I have been there since the beginning, and there shall be, back in September 5 of 2000. And we have had a commitment from the beginning to accountability to the taxpayers and to outcomes. So I can tell the taxpayers that the 18,600 children who have gone through diversion programs because they had a little brush with the law, 90 to 96% of them have not committed another offense within a year after completing the program.
It's an amazing statistic.
It really is.
It's incredible.
There really is no organized opposition to this ballot question, is there, that we've seen? But I think what your concern is that voters just won't see the question, understand the question. Ballots can be confusing.
So it started out, we were concerned just that people wouldn't know that we existed, because for years we only cared that they knew about the agencies that we fund, such as the Boys and Girls Club and the YMCA, ARC Broward, Hispanic Unity. They didn't need to know about us. They just needed to know their children were getting water safety lessons through Swim Central. But now the concern is that they won't find us.
All right, well, you have brought along, this took going to court and a little mediation too, but tell us, where is the question on the ballot and what voters are going to, if you haven't voted already or if you're voting earlier today in Broward County, you're going to find this. And what is this, Cindy? Explain.
Yes. So every voter in Broward County should get within their privacy sleeve this bright yellow notice that tells them to look at the back of page 1 or the front of page 2, that there are 4 issues, and that the bottom one on the third column is the Children's Services Council. Right. It's not directing them how to vote. I can't do that either. I want them to do their research and see the great things that we do. but they need to make sure that when they vote, they know what they're voting on.
Cindy, can you break down the numbers? What does it cost in property tax per property owner, and what does that fund?
A $200,000 assessed value, $150,000 taxable value, they pay $73 a year.
So that's an average 73, or maybe a little more, maybe a
20
little
cents a day, yes. And for that, 150,000 children a year are getting services that range from water safety, programs for moms with maternal depression. There are after-school programs. 8,000 children a year who are low income are getting after-school programs in elementary school, and the special needs. Glenna, what we've been doing with special needs is unprecedented
How do you
in the
define,
country.
excuse me, how do you define special needs, Cindy?
Children with special developmental or physical challenges. So it could be autism or Down syndrome, or it could be blind, deaf. Those children are getting specialized after-school and summer programs that are helping them gain the social skills. Oftentimes those children are brilliant, but they don't necessarily have the social skills in order to advance, and so it's really helping them.
So how do you decide, how does the CSC decide which of those programs will get CSC funding and make sure that there's not a duplication of services?
We lead the community in the Children's Strategic Plan that brings us all together to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts, that we're working together, and that as a community we're data-driven. We're looking at which way are the statistics going. Are more children graduating or fewer children graduating? Are fewer children becoming pregnant, having brushes with the law? We look at that, and then we do research on best practices for what we want those programs to be. And then it's a very transparent and open request for proposals process.
Yeah, well, you have roughly 100 service providers that you contract with. How often do you look at the data from them and say they're not earning their money and we're going to go to another provider?
Every year we have people that go in and look programmatically at what's happening, and it's people who are really subject matter experts that are going in. And in teams that are looking at the outcome data, that are looking at their interactions of the staff with the children, if that's appropriate, say in an after-school program, what are those interactions like? We use teachers in many cases to look at those interactions. And then we're studying the data, then we do fiscal monitoring as well.
Yeah.
And the council looks at that every year and makes a decision.
Well, we will hope that people find your issue on the ballot, and if I lived in Broward County, I'm glad to say I'd vote for it.
Good information. Thank you so much for being here.
We just ask them to look at www.cscbroward.org to get all the information on all those statistics.
Thank you, and
You
done.
just got it in. Thanks, Cindy.
Next up, shifting polls, an infusion of dark money, and crunching the numbers in the governor's race. The roundtable is right after the break.
Kicks the dog.
Yeah.
You should have heard us
Can we
laughing.
talk about
I'm
that?
not
I
an
just saw you
attorney.
went on TV.
Oh, my God.
I'm not an attorney.
All right, it is time to take it to the round table, and what a round table we have, a pre-election edition, and for that we have a great panel of political minds, some a little warped, who have been watching and writing about
which we actually like.
The races daily. We do indeed.
One of those is Mark Caputo, political reporter and columnist for the Miami Herald, and of course Anthony Mann, the Sun-Sentinel's political reporter, and also both roundtable veterans, as is Sean Foreman, professor of political science at Barry University, who follows politics and the local races closely, daily. We've kind of been living this for the past couple of weeks, months. Who can't wait for this to be over?
It's so much fun. The whole show.
I know. What will we talk about next week?
Well, we'll find something, but let's talk right now about where the race stands. The Quinnipiac poll out this week had Christ up by 3. The Eldon Schroth poll had it Scott up by 2. So, Mark, you, I think, follow these polls as closely as anybody. Where does it stand?
Well, both of them are inside the error margin, and both of them have basically opposite findings that are essentially the same. That is, it's a tie. This is a tie race.
Yeah.
And, you know, as I say, the dumbest and smartest thing said in politics is that it's all about turnout. So this election is going to be won or lost on election day. Right now, Republicans have an advantage in early and absentee ballots cast, about 125,000 or so.
Is there any doubt that the Republicans' vote cast and the Democratic votes cast are going to be Republican and Democratic votes? You know,
generally
there's not going to be a turnover or crossover.
There is crossover, but they cross-cancel. You see, so roughly 75 to 85, depending on the poll percent, Republicans vote for the Republican. About 85% of the Democrats vote for the Democrat. The question is, how do the independents break? They're breaking Chris. The question is, do they break enough?
You're going to be hard-pressed to find any Democrats who are voting for Rick Scott. You might get a few moderate Republicans, old friends of Charlie, who will cross over. But, you know, I think we can be pretty confident those numbers go right down the line. Again, it's the independents. But the polls show we really are going to be watching this all night. If you think, you know, Rick Scott won by 62,000 last time, Barack Obama won by 75,000 in 2012, I wouldn't expect us to be anywhere else right now.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting is that, Tony, the Republicans have been saying, well, you know, in the early voting and absentee, our numbers are up. We're 5%, I think. I know you're number crunching every day, 5% up now. But that's actually not good news if you look historically, because in 2010, they were up, what, like 12 to 14 points by now.
Well, it's good to be ahead, and it's always good to be ahead, and they are. It would be better for them if they were more ahead than they are right now. But the big question that we really don't know for sure is, to what extent both campaigns are cannibalizing the people that otherwise would vote on Election Day. Now that so many people are voting early.
Excuse me, Tony. The Republican memo I saw this morning said the big turnout among Democrats who are early voting or absentee are the people who would have voted anyway. So it's not as if they are new voters.
Well, to some extent, that's true. What we don't know is how many new voters there are. Both sides throw out statistics about how they've recruited X number of people who didn't vote in the 2010 gubernatorial election.
Well, we don't want to get too inside baseball here.
In the end, it's Kabbalah. I mean, the reality is that let's look at the raw numbers. Yes, yes, Jewish mysticism. No, or Gnosticism. In the end, as Tony said, the Republicans are up, and the Democrats are, as a result, down. And it's incumbent on the Democrats, if they want to win, to get more of their people to the polls. And they have them.
Sean, I need to ask you your opinion on this. This is, I think, for Democrats, for Charlie Crist, maybe the most important day of early voting because it souls to the polls. There are buses at African-American churches throughout South Florida. As soon as services are over, they are taking a lot of people to the polls to vote. Who knows how that's going, but that is big for Charlie.
It is huge. People going to vote as we speak or right after the show. They're missing the show. They'll have to DVR it because they're...
We're online, by the way, later. It's all
they're
good.
at church. But interesting, Tony actually saw Rick Scott at a black church this morning.
I was going to say, let's break some news here today.
They're going to see Joe Biden later on. But let's look at that number tomorrow morning and we'll have a better idea.
Yeah. So what did you see this morning, Tony?
Well, Governor Scott went to one of the oldest Baptist church in Broward County, an overwhelmingly black congregation, and pitched himself, talked about some of his biography, and didn't say, obviously from the pulpit, vote for me, but he got a warm reception at this church. They didn't announce it to the media, and were surprised. They were surprised when I showed up. But so he's trying to work some of this too on Souls to the Polls Day.
But I have to say, I've been covering this race now for months, and I don't recall one instance where Rick Scott has gone to a black community, I mean, a exclusively black community, and said anything. Mark, do you remember anything?
Not that I recall, but it's election season, and why not try to at least keep your opponent's base from turning out for him?
Well, the insiders on the Scott's campaign say this man is completely data-driven. There is not a day that goes by that he doesn't go deep into the data, so maybe he found something there that spurred a trip this morning to a Fort Lauderdale church.
But the real push is today. I mean, later today in Fort Lauderdale, Vice President Biden is going to be at a black church, and that the people there are going to merge into the planned Souls to the Polls march down Sistrunk Boulevard to the early voting site at the African American Library in Fort Lauderdale. So, I mean, this is a huge push for the Democrats.
All right, well, the Miami Herald, I think probably, I haven't seen the Sun Sentinel yet today, Tony, but the Herald is reporting that Ann and Rick Scott put in about $13 million of their own money into the campaign in the last 10 days, and the Scott campaign is spending another $20 million, most of it on TV ads. And I guess the question would be, Mark, is it going to make any difference at this point?
Well, obviously, you had said before that Rick Scott is data-driven. He's not going to put in his own money if he doesn't think it's going to make a difference.
Yeah.
I mean, have any of the ads and all of the spending really made a difference up until now? Great question. But, he was outspending Charlie Crist more than 2 to 1 before this, and then he sinks in, basically $13 million. And it turns out 13.8, almost 14 million is the exact spread, the difference in the volume of ads that Rick Scott is going to be running over Charlie Crist in the last 2 weeks of the election.
So what you're saying is it's all ad money.
It's all ad money. Great for you guys.
Well, it is good for TV stations. I want to go on the record and say again, I think the Citizens United decision, which allows this kind of spending to go on, is not good for the small d democratic process. But then again, helps pay my modest salary.
Well, that we're going to have, they reported $150 million between the candidates and the parties that are running ads for this election, but it's probably going to be closer to $200 million on this governor's race because there's this dark money from Citizens United, from the decision allowing third-party groups to spend that we can't really calculate as easily as the reported money.
And then there is money, and Mark and Tony have both reported on this, from Tom Steyer, a Republican who's got Next Gen Climate is the name of his group, and he is spending, what, $15 million on this race in Florida.
I think we're at 12 for him as of last count, roughly $6 million on ads. Total in ads that we've been able to calculate so far, about $105 million from both sides. Roughly 70 of that is from Scott.
You just, Glenna, don't you think that there are a lot of people who just have got that mute button on their remote going?
Or DVR the news and don't even watch. Although some can quote those ads by now. Okay, good time to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Roundtable. One day we're going to dispense with the commercial so you hear what goes on during the commercial break, which is actually really good. Mark Caputo from the Miami Herald, Anthony Mann, Sun Sentinel, Sean Foreman, political science professor at Barry University, and we are talking about the big money and the big names out for the governor's race. And
there's some really big names who are campaigning with the candidates. As we saw in a live report a few minutes ago, Joe Biden probably starting right now out at FIU for Charlie Crist. Jeb Bush this afternoon is going to be at Mailander Park in Hialeah with Governor Scott. Chris Christie has been with him. Rick Perry is going to campaign with Scott on Monday. At this point, what does that do? Does it make any difference, Sean?
I do think it does, marginally, in getting your voters out. Bill Clinton as well, coming in for Charlie Crist and cutting ads as Jeb Bush did for Scott. I mean, that motivates the base. If you're not really excited about Charlie Crist or Rick Scott, you are, if you're a hardcore party person, excited to see these other big names come in. It's a chance to see them, try to get a selfie with them.
Does it transfer over to a vote?
I think that it does. It's unscientific, but you know, again, you're trying to get people excited about the brand.
Yeah, I think the Bill Clinton ad for Crist is really pretty effective. And then you see the Rick Scott ad that shows Charlie saying he should resign, and
that's a pretty effective ad too. I
yes,
think.
it
I think
is.
They're both.
Yeah. Well, can we take a second now and a minute and talk about Attorney General's race, because Pam Bondi was in the center of a big story in the New York Times this week. Tampa Bay Times also had one that said that she is a member of the Republican Attorneys General Association, and as such, she has gone off to some extravagant, lush, expensive resorts. She's taken lots of freebie trips. She has dined well, and then she has met with representatives of companies, lawyers for companies, who have been sued by other attorneys general around the country, but not sued in Florida. I mean, Mark, this really, I think, would be fairly damaging, but will it make any difference in this race?
No. I mean, she's up by double digits. She's campaigning against George Sheldon, a nice guy, let's say, but he's a no-name. And that makes a difference. You have to have money and a name to run an effective campaign in a state as big as Florida.
Is that the Nan Rich factor?
I would say so, yeah. I think they're both Broward Democrats. There's also that similarity as well. But, you know, this is the big time, and to compete in the big time, you have to have a professional level operation and a big name, and they don't have it.
Of these stories about Pam Bondi, I would say it stinks. It's really terrible to see that her and other Democrat and Republican attorney generals are taking trips, taking money, and then there's evidence that cases were not pursued.
Yes.
And maybe this will end up being criminal, but I think it's too little too late in terms of campaigning. And also George Sheldon's just not a strong candidate. That's really hurting Charlie Crist as well.
And we are going to hear a little from George Sheldon later in this program. All right, let's move on to the 26th Congressional District, the Joe Garcia-Carlos Curbelo race. Turns out the Miami Herald, Patty Mazzei, your colleague, did a good story yesterday. It turns out that he misreported $93,000 in contributions. Now, a couple of $1,000 isn't going to raise any eyebrows, but Sean, I think $93,000, you kind of say to yourself, boy, what's going on?
That is odd. I think you have to ask Mr. Curbelo more about that. They claim it was a software glitch. They changed programs, usually of reporting the income. Usually when this an error happens, you find out in a day or two. This took them 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
So it's very fishy, but on the other hand, I don't see how they would try to get away with something like that right before the election.
Well, I don't think they're trying to get away with it, but it seems to be a management issue in your campaign.
Well, certainly sloppy. And it certainly doesn't help, especially in a district that has been plagued by shadowy money, incomplete, inaccurate, and not Carlos, but one of his predecessors, fraudulently filed campaign finance reports.
Well, and accusations from both sides, just an ugly, nasty race, that something like this, no matter what the amount, a mistake, a glitch, a hidden money, I mean, it just doesn't play well.
But it's still probably not big enough at the end of a campaign where all the attention is going to the governor's race, even in that district. It's hard for that to break through to people and make a big difference.
All right, well, on the subject of the governor's race, I want to put each of you guys on the spot where you think the race stands right now, and Mark, where do you think it stands?
Well, Rick Scott's leading. Republicans are leading in early and absentee ballots. That puts the pressure on the Florida Democratic Party, which has had a penchant for losing midterm elections since the mid-1990s, to actually not do that this time. So certainly advantage Rick Scott. Is it over? Definitely not. But the pressure's on Crist, not on Scott.
Yeah. Tony?
It really could go either way. It is a tied race. And the fact you mentioned a moment ago about these big-name Democrats coming in, they would not have the vice president in Florida today, and they wouldn't have...
He flew from California overnight, I think, to be here at this rally.
And they wouldn't have Bill Clinton in tomorrow if they didn't think that Crist would be able to push it through at the end.
Right.
And the last word, as you sit here chuckling.
Right, yeah, you're putting us on the spot. It certainly is tied. I'd say advantage Scott because of the fundamentals and the Florida voting history, but I would not be surprised if the Democrats can pull this out because of the reasons my colleagues mentioned.
A split verdict. Thank you all.
Somewhat split.
Sort of split.
I don't know.
The bottom line,
it's
just like the
somebody
polls,
on
who
points,
knows?
but I'm not sure who it is. All right, Mark, Tony, Sean,
Thanks so much.
thank you very much for coming in.
The race for state attorney general prior to a few minutes ago hasn't gotten too much attention, except recently with some very unflattering stories about incumbent Pam Bondi that we've discussed.
As we just mentioned, the New York Times published a story this week about how she's taken all these freebies from companies which have been sued by attorneys general in other states, not in Florida. Bondi says did nothing wrong. We will hear from that man on the screen, the opponent, George Sheldon, coming up next. We have tried for weeks to put together a debate for you between the candidates for Florida Attorney General, but no deal.
Campaign reps for incumbent Pam Bondi said she was too busy with work to take the time. She did participate in one locally televised debate in Tampa with Democratic challenger George Sheldon. Sheldon did come into our studios recently for an interview with Michael.
One of the criticisms that she has come under by both the Sun Sentinel and the Miami Herald, and in commentaries, in fact, that I have done, is her unwillingness to stop appealing the decisions on same-sex marriage in the wake of the Supreme Court decision in which it refused to hear the cases from 5 appellate districts. And she continues to appeal that. Now, she says, look, I'm defending our Constitution, the Florida Constitution, 2008. 62% of voters said that they think that marriage should be between a man and a woman. She says, look, I'm defending the Constitution. Is that a defensible argument?
Well, I think if in reality all she was doing that, that's one thing. But the rhetoric in her brief was beyond the pale. The other point I would make is she has a higher responsibility, and that's to defend the Constitution of the United States. 39 federal and state courts have thrown that ban out. But this is a pattern. She intervenes in the Chesapeake Bay because the Fertilizer Institute asked her to. When we ought to be dealing with the Everglades, she intervened to oppose women's right to certain contraceptives and employer-paid policies. It's really a pattern of her doing those kind of things that appeal to the extreme right wing, as opposed to intervening in utility rate increases, for instance, which every attorney general has done back to the 1960s.
Has she not gone before the PSC or objected to rate increases asked for by Duke Energy or FP&L?
Every attorney general has done that, through Charlie Crist, through Bob Butterworth, through Bill McCollum. She has not intervened in any. When I brought that up in the debate, she said, well, I did intervene against Aqua Utility. Aqua Utility is a small utility in Hernando County, not Florida Power, not Duke. Duke has taken $1.5 billion in fees to build a nuclear power plant, which they're now not going to build.
Right.
You ought to be going and demanding that that be paid back to the ratepayer.
Well, the PSC finally, under the Public Service Commission, under a lot of pressure, told Duke a few days ago, you've got to give that money back.
Well, in effect, what they did is they directed Duke to pay back $54 million. Mm-hmm. Even Rick Scott would take that kind of investment. $54 million, in return you get $1.5 billion. Yeah. I'm not sure that's a fair decision.
That is George Sheldon, the Democrat running for Attorney General. Once again, we tried our best to try to get Pam Bondi to come in just by herself, and she refused to do so.
Yeah. This election has actually had plenty of political theater in that race and others. And coming up, a bit of the real story behind the story that voters like you should know. A live look right now from our Fort Lauderdale tower cam. Does it get better than this?
No, it does not. It is gorgeous. And speaking of gorgeous, here is Jennifer Correa. Whoa! That's our Sunday forecast.
Thank you, Michael. And good morning, Michael and Glenda. And we have had such wonderful weather this weekend. But talk about the cool down that brought us those temperatures early this morning. We're in the 50s. Now we're in the mid to upper 60s. That's still on the cool side. We have that north wind, and it's brisk out there, making it feel a lot cooler, between 10 to 15 miles per hour. And also high rip current risk still in effect all throughout today along our Atlantic coast. Also, if you're heading out on the water, small craft advisories in effect. The bays are choppy from Miami-Dade to Broward. Very rough for the Keys due to those gusty winds. But we'll stay cool. Once again, tonight we're dropping down to the low 60s, still below normal for our Monday. And then very nice Tuesday. Nice start to the work week. We go back to normal with a high of 84 on Wednesday and a 20% chance for a passing shower. Enjoy the beautiful weather and have a great weekend.
Carlos! Thank you, Carlos! You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, this moment of Lieutenant Governor Love was clearly for the cameras.
We saw firsthand this week when it comes to going before the cameras, the running mate race has more drama and dysfunction than a high school sitcom. And that's something you should know about candidates asking for your confidence in them as your potential head of state. We, and other news outlets too, delivered opportunities for you to hear from and compare the candidates. Unscripted, authentic Q&A, that's our job, our public service. But the optics and the image of it all seems to be more important to the candidates and or to their handlers. In what has been such a negative campaign season all the way around, both Annette Taddeo and Carlos Lopez Cantera, the candidates for lieutenant governor, they've repeatedly accused the other of refusing to debate. Well, the fact is, both did, and did with us just in the last 36 hours after both did agree to appear on this program. First, Taddeo's camp said they decided to be in Orlando. So we lined up a satellite truck and out-of-town staff to make that happen. And then Lopez Cantera's camp said he would only do an interview with us, though he did confirm he would show up, and as you saw, he did. In the end, it didn't matter anyway, because Taddeo's campaign called to say, though they would now be in South Florida, after all, they had done enough interviews and would not be coming in. So why does all this matter? Well, you've seen how tough it is to pull plain, direct answers from the quicksand of scripted stage talking points. Candidates have become products, packaged and managed. And consider when you're marking your ballots that people, not products, make good leaders. What do you think? We invite you to weigh in on any topic at all that you like. Email, Facebook, Twitter. Here are all the addresses. We are very easy to find.
And as always, I will remind you to stay informed, stay involved, get informed.
Con fuerza.
Con fuerza.
Have a great Sunday. Beautiful Sunday. Go out and vote if you haven't yet. Are you ready?